Hello everyone, it's Danny. Okay, so in the second part, we will discuss about how to properly choose an orchid pot for your orchid. In the first part, we discussed about the different types of pots you can find available, so if you missed that one, you have a link towards that video in the description. Alrighty, so in this second part, as I told you, we're going to discuss some other important things to consider when choosing an orchid pot. Let us start by discussing about the size of the pot you should choose for your orchid. Now, there is a rule going on the internet, and this is that you should adapt the size of your pot to the orchid's root system. If the orchid doesn't have too many roots, you should use a smaller pot, and then again, if the orchid has a lot of roots, you should adapt the pot to a bigger size. I have to tell you guys, this is partially true, but definitely you should never take it too literally, and I'll give you some examples so you can better understand what I mean. As you know, an orchid feels pretty well if she's a little snug in the pot. So when choosing an orchid pot, you should definitely be able to fit all the orchid's roots inside the pot, but also not to give it too much space. So if the roots are a bit snug, but you can still fit some media inside, that's what you're looking for. Now, what you're not looking for are the following things. First of all, you definitely do not need a super huge pot for a very tiny orchid. Let's say you have a seedlings or just a mini orchid. You should adapt the pot size to the root system, of course, but also to the size of the plant. Now, this is a good pot for this plant. It even looks good. But imagine if you would have this little plant in this pot. And I hope you can see here how tall and big this pot is compared to my orchid. Now, this orchid would wobble around in this pot, and it would just be super huge for this orchid, which will not produce at this stage a very huge root system. So she will slightly be insecure in this pot because she will not find the size of the pot to wrap her roots around it like they like to do, and so on. So this is definitely a no-no. Also, you should not only take into consideration the root system. Let us, for example, assume this orchid does not have any roots, or maybe it has one or two roots. Because the orchid could actually fit in a pot like this, you would be tempted to pot it in something like this. But keep in mind, this orchid is not a mini orchid. It will grow, it already has a new shoot, it will produce an extensive root system which will fill up this pot pretty fast. And also, look at this. There is absolutely no room where some new growth can actually develop properly. So never take into consideration the amount of root system the orchid has. Take into consideration the size of the orchid and its pattern of growth. Because if you have a mature orchid which does not have roots, it will fill up something like this in a matter of months, and you will be forced to repot again because the orchid will not have space to develop, and also because the root system will absorb so much moisture in so little time that you will have trouble keeping it hydrated. A decent pot size for this orchid would be something like this. This is a standard, I don't know, 15 centimeter pot. This allows the orchid to produce an extensive root system, also allows this growth to grow and mature because it will most probably be the same size as the mother bulb, and also it leaves another year's, at least, or 2 years growth space, so I can keep this orchid in this pot for at least 2 years without having any problem of space or desiccation because there is no more media to offer the moisture that this orchid needs. On the other hand, a pot like this is perfectly fine for a tiny orchid or a seedling. Now, this seedling will not grow super huge anytime soon, nor will it create a super huge root system anytime soon. So a mini orchid or seedling can do very well for about 2 years in a pot like this. Again, take into consideration the size of the plant, the size of the root system, and its pattern of growth. Now let us discuss about the type of the pot you will use for your orchid. Now, most orchids you can find are perfectly fine in your standard pot, which is not too wide, and it's also higher than wider. Now, these pots are perfectly fine for Phalaenopsis, Calea orchids, Dendrobiums, Oncidiums, and most orchids you can find available. However, they're not very suited for different types of orchids, and I'll give you some examples. Here we have the Silagene orchid. As you can see, this orchid doesn't really grow in height. Her preferred pattern is horizontal actually, and also the flower spikes are pendulous. As well, this orchid does not create a super extensive root system. She really does not need tall pots. Now, a basket which is quite shallow but quite wide is perfectly fine for this orchid and its way of growth. The pot that I showed you earlier is not necessarily as good as this for this particular orchid. Also, there are orchids like the Paphinia here, which is kind of deciduous at the moment, which produce flower spikes from below its pseudobulbs. So practically they will come out through one of these holes. Now, a solid pot is not suited for this type of orchid because the flower spike cannot go out of the pot. It's the same story with Gongoras and Stanhopias, or at least some varieties of them. A solid pot is not suited for them, but a sort of basket like this, which has quite a few wide holes, is perfectly fine for them, as the flower spikes will eventually come out from the bottom or the side of the pot. Now let's discuss a little bit about when you should change the pot size of your orchid. Let's say you have an orchid for quite a few years or quite a lot of time and you need to repot it. Now, how should you know if you need to up the pot size or not? I'll give you some examples because it is pretty hard to explain with words. I'll give you an example of an orchid which definitely needs a upping in the pot size at her next repotting, and this is one of my oncidiums. If you can see here, there are a lot of roots. If I would repot this orchid tomorrow and I would try to fit it back in this pot, it will not fit, I can assure you. They make use of the space available so well that when I untangle them, they will not fit back. So for this orchid, I might actually go one pot size up. And here is an example of an orchid which probably does not need a resize of the pot. If I were to repot this orchid tomorrow, most probably all these roots will fit back quite comfortable in this pot. So when you repot an orchid, first unpot it and check the root system. When you try to put it back in the pot, if it fits and also you can add media quite easily around the roots, then the pot size is well chosen. If the orchid barely fits in the same pot anymore and you have to struggle to put in the media around the roots, most probably your orchid can do with an upping in the pot size. But I would like to extend this subject a little bit more. Let's say you're dealing with an orchid which produces pseudobulbs of any sorts, either canes, either pseudobulbs, so not a Phalaenopsis orchid. It is advisable to repot when your orchid simply does not have any more room to produce pseudobulbs. Let's take this pseudobulb for example. It barely fits right now on this side. The new pseudobulb it will produce after, let's say, 6 months will definitely not fit back in the pot. So most probably it will grow out and it will extend its root system outside of the pot. Now this is a good candidate to receive a bigger pot simply because it does not fit physically in this pot anymore. With Phalaenopsis orchids, this is not the case because they do not produce pseudobulbs each year. So when repotting a Phalaenopsis orchid, you are safe to actually judge it more based on the root system than on the size of the orchid. But keep in mind, the rule I mentioned earlier with the small pot still applies to this girl. So if this orchid wouldn't have had any roots, I wouldn't have potted into anything smaller than this pot, because this is actually the pot size that fits the size of my orchid, the size of the leaves and of the root system. I can easily keep this orchid another 2 years in this pot. And as a final idea, never plant your orchid, any type of orchid, in a pot that does not have any drainage holes. Whether it's a ceramic pot or a plastic pot, it is not a good idea if the pot doesn't have drainage. The orchid will eventually suffocate because water will accumulate on the bottom, it will start to rot the media and eventually kill your orchid. But if you like the looks of things, just take your orchid pot and place it inside the decorative pot. Just make sure there is some space in between the rim of the decorative pot and the plastic pot of the orchid, so air can actually circulate and aerate the root system. Okay everyone, I hope you found this video useful, and if you have more suggestions for me, just leave me a comment and I will try to make a video. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more videos, and of course send me your questions if you have any questions regarding to orchids. I'll see you next time. Thank you for joining. Bye!